He was about 6 feet tall, that he was completely scourged all over his body. He was crucified, and nobody dies for a lie.
Something happened behind the cameras of The Passion of the Christ that Hollywood has never fully explained. Lightning struck the lead actor in the exact same spot twice. More than 10 terrifying accidents ripped through that set one after another.
I shot me out of my body. I saw the back side, not here, and I remember looking at him, and all of a sudden I saw his hand blow up.
And then things got darker. Strange presences. Unexplainable events that left the crew shaken to their core. As filming pushed forward, Mel Gibson began to understand that what was happening around him had moved far beyond a movie production. Something else was in that place. Something that could not be explained away or written off as coincidence. What happened on that set is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the history of cinema, and we are tearing every single piece of it open. Brace yourself, because what you are about to hear is going to leave you deeply unsettled. The man who bet everything on God. One night, Mel Gibson was alone in his house, and he got down on his hands and knees and begged God to let him die. He cried desperately for death. When this happened, he already had fame. He had just come off a string of films that made him one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. Studios were calling him. From the outside, he had everything. But inside that house, his life seemed to have no direction. He was drinking himself apart, night after night. His marriage was rotting from the inside. He described himself later as empty, hollow, and completely without reason to keep going. He could see exactly what he was doing to the people around him. He could see the destruction happening in real time, and he could not stop it. That same night, Mel opened a Bible. He had no idea how that single decision would turn his life around. Mel had been raised in a deeply Catholic household by a father of strict and serious faith. But Mel Gibson, the movie star, had abandoned all of that years earlier. Faith belonged to his childhood, not to the empire he had spent decades building. But that night, with nowhere left to go and nothing left to try, he started reading, and he could not stop. He became consumed by the Gospels, specifically the chapters describing the Passion and the Crucifixion. He read them every single day. He studied every detail. He buried himself in the mystical writings of a German mystic named Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, a woman who had never once left her own country, yet described locations in the Holy Land with a geographical precision that archaeologists later confirmed was accurate. Her visions of the crucifixion were so specific and so detailed that Gibson used them as a primary source alongside the Gospels themselves. Somewhere inside all of those pages, something that had been buried inside him for a very long time tore its way back to the surface. He said later, "I was a terrible man. My sins were the first to nail Christ to the cross." That one sentence was the ignition point for everything that followed. From that moment, Mel Gibson no longer wanted to make Hollywood movies. He wanted redemption. And he had decided that the only road to it was to tell this story. Not a polished Hollywood production with familiar faces and a swelling soundtrack. The real story, with all its rawness and all its horror, with nothing softened. So, he made the decision that everyone around him believed was pure madness. The film would be spoken entirely in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin, the actual languages Jesus and the people around him spoke 2,000 years ago. Not one word of English, and there would be no Hollywood stars. He wanted audiences to see Jesus, not an actor pretending to be Jesus. He carried that idea into every major studio in Hollywood, and every single one of them threw it back in his face directly, without a shred of sympathy. Some of them told him, to his face, it would be the most catastrophic flop ever produced. They told him to add English dialogue, reduce the violence, cast someone audiences already recognized, give it an uplifting ending. He refused every single condition without blinking once. He said, "If I give in on that, it will not be Christ's story anymore. It will be Hollywood's version of Christ's story." So, he did something that stands as one of the most audacious financial gambles in the history of cinema. He sold his properties and liquidated everything he owned. He poured $45 million of his own personal money into production, with no studio behind him, no distributor lined up, and no guarantee that a single human being outside his own house would ever see it. If the film failed, he He would lose every dollar he had built over 20 years in the industry. He said later, "It was not a movie I wanted to make. It was a movie I had to make." Now he needed the right man to carry Jesus on screen, and this is precisely where the story starts to get strange. For months, Gibson rejected every famous name that came across his desk. He did not want recognizable faces. He wanted someone willing to genuinely suffer for this role. And then a name surfaced: Jim Caviezel, a Catholic actor with a calm but penetrating gaze and a career that had not yet exploded into stardom. Gibson invited him to his home in Malibu. The meeting was supposed to last a few minutes, but stretched into 3 hours. They talked about faith, darkness, sacrifice, and about the cost to carry this story on a human body for months of filming. And then Gibson delivered the warning. He looked directly at Caviezel and said, "If you take this role, you might never work in Hollywood again." There was a long silence, and then Caviezel answered, "Each of us has our own cross to bear. We either carry it, or we are crushed beneath its weight." Gibson pondered deeply, and then something happened in that room that made both of them go completely still. Caviezel mentioned almost casually that he had just turned 33 years old. The age Christ was at the crucifixion. Gibson stared at him. And then Caviezel quietly added that his initials were JC. Gibson froze completely, and then he said, "You are freaking me out." From that moment, the commitment between them was locked and absolute. And what was about to happen on the set of that film would shake everyone involved far more violently than a coincidence of initials ever could. Gibson had his actor. He had his money committed and his location secured in the ancient and rugged landscape of Matera, Italy. What he did not have was any idea of what was about to be unleashed the moment those cameras started rolling. Because from the very first days of filming, something began happening that nobody on that set could explain. It started with the weather, and then it became something that no meteorological reasoning could come close to touching. Subtopic 2. What happened on that set that nobody can explain? From the opening days of filming in Matera, something was deeply wrong with the air on that set. Sudden total silences crashed down over the entire crew between takes with no identifiable cause. Wind gusts exploded from nowhere and vanished just as fast. Clear sunny mornings collapsed into dark, oppressive skies within minutes with no explanation. The crew convinced themselves it was simply unpredictable weather in an unfamiliar region. They kept telling themselves that right up until the day the lightning shattered everything. After the lightning, nobody on that set told themselves anything was normal again. The crew had climbed into the hills above Matera to shoot one of the most hopeful scenes in the entire film, the Sermon on the Mount. The air was still. The sky was wide open and clear. Caviezel was preparing to ascend the hill while technicians adjusted microphones and repositioned cameras around him. And then within seconds, the entire atmosphere collapsed. The air thickened with abnormal pressure. Clouds piled overhead with a speed that defied any natural explanation. Caviezel said, for one brief moment, a chill tore straight down his spine, and he knew with complete certainty that something was coming. And then a white bolt of lightning ripped through the sky and struck him directly. It tore through his entire body from head to toe. The blast was deafening and instantaneous. Every single camera on set shut down at the same moment. Technicians screamed and scattered in every direction. Several crew members hit the ground. And then, absolute silence fell over everything. From a distance below, Mel Gibson stood watching as Jim Caviezel remained standing on that hill, completely engulfed in blinding light, his hair sparking, his clothing smoldering around his body. He had survived, and nobody on that set could understand how. Then the assistant director, John Michelini, sprinted up the hill toward him. When Michelini reached Caviezel's side, a second bolt of lightning detonated in the identical spot. In 60 seconds, lightning had struck the same location twice. Both men were hurled to the ground by the force of the blast. The crew stood frozen below, staring upward in silence. Some were weeping openly. Some were already on their knees praying. The paramedics reached both men and discovered something they said they had never witnessed in their entire careers. No burns, no visible injuries on either man. Just dazed expressions, slightly scorched clothing, and the sharp chemical bite of ozone hanging in the still air. The paramedics stated plainly that they had never encountered a single person who survived even one lightning strike without injury. What they were looking at had no medical explanation they could honestly give. From that day forward, the entire production transformed. Every workday began with prayer before any equipment was switched on. Technicians who had never prayed a day in their professional lives crossed themselves before powering up their cameras. And the weather itself began behaving in ways the crew could no longer dismiss or explain. When they filmed scenes of suffering and agony, dark clouds gathered overhead. When they captured moments of grace and forgiveness, sunlight broke through the sky and flooded the set. After a while, the crew stopped searching for rational explanations entirely. They accepted what was happening and kept filming. But the lightning was not the strangest thing that happened on that set. During production, multiple crew members began reporting something that none of them had discussed with each other until weeks had passed. Each had witnessed men dressed in white moving calmly through the set between the cameras. These figures gave precise instructions about lighting positions and camera angles. They carried themselves with a quiet authority that nobody challenged in the moment. Their directions were specific and correct. And when crew members tried to identify them afterward, nobody could. They appeared in no hiring records. Nobody had contracted them. Nobody recognized them from anywhere or from any previous production. What makes these accounts genuinely difficult to set aside is not simply that multiple people reported the same thing. It is that when crew members who had never spoken to each other about what they saw finally sat down weeks later and compared their accounts independently, every single detail matched precisely. The clothing, the manner, the nature of the directions given, the quality of quiet authority these figures projected. These figures appeared in no set photography. They were absent from every piece of behind-the-scenes footage, and according to several crew members who went back and checked specifically, they appeared on none of the studio security camera recordings either. These accounts have never been confirmed by any official production record and must be understood as crew testimony rather than established fact. But the people who reported these experiences have maintained every detail of their accounts consistently for over 20 years. And Gibson's own response when pressed about unexplained events on set was simply this: "There were things no one can explain, but everything happened exactly as it was meant to." There were also separate reports of unexplained lights appearing briefly on camera during filming, flashes with no identifiable technical source that appeared and vanished without any explanation. And according to accounts that have circulated for years, the lead cameraman reported seeing a luminous figure move slowly behind Caviezel while he was positioned on the cross during filming. The cameraman said he saw it with complete clarity. He checked the footage immediately after the take ended. There was nothing there. These accounts are unverified and have never been officially confirmed, but they have been described consistently by people who were present and have never once been withdrawn. Gibson himself was regularly seen walking away from the set between takes with red and swollen eyes, murmuring prayers under his breath. Makeup artists described experiencing an unexplainable stillness and calm in the middle of conditions that should have felt crushing and chaotic. Seasoned professionals who had worked across dozens of major productions said openly that the atmosphere on that set was unlike anything they had felt before. Something was present on that set. Nobody could name it with absolute certainty, but nobody could deny it. The supernatural atmosphere was real to everyone who worked on that production. But while all of it was happening in the air around them, something else was simultaneously happening to the body of the actor. What was being done to Jim Caviezel during the making of this film should have shut the production down on multiple separate occasions. It did not shut down because neither the actor nor the director would allow it. And what resulted was one of the most brutal and punishing physical ordeals any performer has ever been put through in the entire history of cinema. Subtopic 3: What they did to the man playing Jesus. Caviezel knew before filming began that this role would demand more from his body than anything he had ever attempted. He said he understood what was being asked. He prepared spiritually by attending daily mass and spending long hours in prayer before every scene. He trained his body with brutal discipline. He believed he was ready for what was coming. He was not ready. Nobody alive could have been ready for what actually happened. The first catastrophic moment came during the scourging scene. Gibson wanted it captured with complete and unflinching realism. He wanted audiences to feel the full crushing weight of what they were watching. To protect Caviezel, the crew positioned a thick wooden board directly behind his back before filming began. During one of the takes, the actor playing a Roman soldier swung the whip too hard and at the wrong angle. The metal tip flew past the protective board and drove itself directly into Caviezel's flesh. The scream that tears through the final film at that moment is not a performance. It is a man going into genuine physical shock from real and sudden pain. The wound tore open a second time during another take. 12 inches of laceration ripped across his back. That scar is still on Jim Caviezel's body today. Gibson never reshot that scene. He never softened it. He never replaced it with a safer version. What exists in the final cut of that film is precisely and exactly what happened on that set on that day. And the suffering did not stop there. Not even for a single moment. The day came to film The Way of the Cross. Gibson insisted on a real wooden cross, not a prop replica, not a lightweight studio substitute built for actor safety. A genuine cross constructed from solid wood, weighing over 150 pounds. Caviezel had to haul it under a scorching sun, collapse under its weight, force himself back upright, and collapse again. During one of the takes, the plan was for a soldier actor to catch the beam at the precise moment of the fall to prevent it from crushing Caviezel on impact. The soldier missed his timing completely, and the cross dropped directly onto Caviezel's head. Caviezel said afterward, "It crushed my head like a melon. Some of the blood was fake, but some of it was mine." The impact had also wrenched his shoulder completely out of its socket. The pain radiating off him was described by everyone present as physically unbearable to witness. The crew surged toward him from every direction. Caviezel refused every offer of help. He told them he wanted that fall in the final film exactly as it had happened. He wanted the world to feel for even one brief moment what it genuinely means to go down under that weight on a human body. Gibson understood without a word needing to be spoken between them. He kept the camera running. Caviezel covered the remaining distance of that scene, with his shoulder fully dislocated, every single movement generating real agony. Doctors confirmed the dislocation the moment the scene ended. They prescribed several days of complete rest. But he was back on set the following morning, with his arm visibly swollen and his shoulder completely numb. He refused to surrender a single day of production. Then winter descended on Matera, and the crucifixion scenes began. And this is where what was happening to Caviezel's body crossed into something that should have been medically impossible to push through. The crucifixion sequences were filmed in the full, merciless cold of an Italian winter. Caviezel hung from the cross for hours at a stretch wearing nothing but a thin tunic, soaked by rain, battered repeatedly by icy wind gusts that cut straight through him. Between takes, the crew worked urgently to warm him, but the conditions overwhelmed every effort. His body temperature dropped to dangerous levels. His lips turned dark purple. His hands shook without stopping. His breathing became thin and labored. The doctors positioned on set confirmed that hypothermia had taken hold of him. Filming was forced to stop repeatedly. But Caviezel refused to leave his position every single time. He said, "Christ did not come down from the cross. Neither will I." The relentless cold combined with the extreme physical punishment then drove him into double pneumonia. His body dropped weight every single day. Each morning, the makeup process required to cover him in wounds, bruises, lacerations, and blood consumed between 8 and 10 full hours. To keep production moving, Caviezel stopped having the makeup removed at the end of each day and simply slept in it. Night after night, he went to sleep covered in fake blood, heavy prosthetics, and theatrical paint. The prosthetics generated blisters across his skin. The freezing temperatures and the paint caused his face to crack open. The makeup artists assigned to him eventually told people they had reached a point where they genuinely could no longer separate the cosmetic damage from the injuries that were entirely his own. No stunt performers, no digital effects substituting for pain. Every scream in that film is real. Every tear is real. Every shudder from the cold is real. Every contorted expression of agony on Caviezel's face in the final cut is the face of a man who is genuinely suffering, not recreating suffering from memory. Gibson refused to cut a single difficult moment from the finished film. When the crew pleaded with him repeatedly to soften certain scenes, to find safer camera positions, to give Caviezel actual time to recover, Gibson gave them the same calm and unmovable sentence every single time. If he can endure it, so can we. By the time the final scene was completed, the boundary between the actor and the character had dissolved so completely that people who had worked alongside Caviezel every day said they could no longer locate where Jim Caviezel ended and the role began. The Passion of the Christ had stopped being a film in production. It had become something that none of them had words for. And what it had become was about to do something to millions of people around the world that no film in history had ever done before. What happened to Caviezel's body during filming was visible, documented, and extreme beyond anything the industry had seen. But what the film then did to the production crew and the audience crossed into territory that nobody had a framework for. Because before The Passion of the Christ reached a single paying audience, it had already broken open and permanently rebuilt the lives of the production crew. Subtopic 4: What the film did to everyone it touched. Before a single ticket was purchased, the film had already permanently altered the lives of people who had simply come to do their jobs. Luca Lionello arrived on that set as a declared atheist. He was completely open and entirely unbothered by it. He accepted the role of Judas Iscariot as a professional acting assignment and nothing more. He was not remotely open to being changed. By the time filming concluded, he had converted to Christianity, been received into the Catholic Church, and been baptized alongside his entire family. He said afterward, "I was a non-believer. I participated in the Passion as an actor, but when it ended, I could not stop thinking about the figure of Jesus. Playing Judas made me understand God's love and forgiveness. The film changed my life. I found faith and received baptism." Pietro Cerubi played Barabbas, the convicted criminal released in place of Jesus. It was a small role with almost no lines. His single most significant moment in the film was one brief exchange of eye contact with Caviezel during the scene before Pilate. That was the entire extent of his role. "One look," Cerubi said later. "When I looked into his eyes, I did not see an actor. I saw a depth that was not human. I felt Jesus looking at me and forgiving me." He could not sleep for weeks after filming wrapped. He embraced faith, was baptized, began speaking publicly across Italy about what had happened to him from that single moment of eye contact, and eventually wrote an entire book titled From Barabbas to Jesus, documenting the transformation that began in one exchange glance on a film set. Rosalinda Celentano played Satan. Gibson chose her specifically because he needed a face that was profoundly androgynous and deeply unsettling, neither clearly male nor clearly female, a presence that would disturb audiences at a level they could not fully rationalize or explain away. Her eyebrows were completely shaved off. She was filmed in slow motion specifically to eliminate any trace of blinking. A man's voice was layered over hers in post-production. She maintained a severe restricted diet throughout filming and lost significant weight. What appears on screen is one of the most genuinely uncomfortable screen presences ever committed to film. During the filming of her central scene, where Satan drifts silently through the crowd, watching the scourging of Jesus, Celentano said afterward that the air surrounding her felt physically heavy in a way she had no technical language for. She said she experienced something during that filming that she could only describe as a genuinely dark and real presence. Whether that was the product of extreme psychological immersion in a deeply disturbing role or something beyond that is impossible to determine. She stepped away from cinema for a substantial period and retreated entirely into painting in private. She said the experience of inhabiting that character had changed her in ways she was still working through years after the film's release. Extras who had arrived as anonymous background performers with no particular religious conviction began requesting confession and baptism before production finished. Crew members, who had showed up as confirmed non-believers, departed as people who were actively and urgently questioning everything they had previously held as certain. By the end of production, the set had ceased to function like any film production any of them had ever experienced. It had become something that none of them had a proper category for. And then, the film was released into the world. On February 25th, 2004, Ash Wednesday, The Passion of the Christ, opened in theaters across the country. There was no red carpet, no marketing blitz, no studio machine driving it into public consciousness. And yet, from the very first morning, the lines outside theaters stretched for entire city blocks. They looked exactly like pilgrimages and nothing at all like cinema queues. People stood in line holding rosaries in complete and deliberate silence. Prayers moved quietly through the crowds under people's breath. Churches organized entire community convoys to attend together. Parishes purchased complete screening blocks for their congregations. What had begun as one shattered man's desperate private act of faith had ignited into a collective movement that no advertising budget had built, and no studio could have manufactured or replicated. Inside the theaters, things happened that cinema had never once produced before. In Kansas on the premiere day itself, a 56-year-old woman suffered a fatal heart attack during the crucifixion scene and died in her seat. Reports of fainting, uncontrollable weeping, and acute physical reactions during the flogging sequences poured in from theaters across multiple countries within the first week of release. Theater managers in several major cities began stationing medical personnel inside screening rooms after the first wave of incidents came in. No film in the history of the medium had ever generated documented medical emergencies at that scale during its theatrical run. In Brazil, people began confessing their sins aloud in theater lobbies because they genuinely could not wait to reach a church. In the Philippines, screenings were interrupted by audience members who dropped to their knees and prayed loudly in the aisles. A woman in Argentina reported a partial restoration of her eyesight after praying in front of the screen during the film. A young drug addict in Italy walked away from his addiction completely after watching it. A priest in Brazil reported that during a community screening, his entire congregation began confessing through tears without any prompt from anyone present. The numbers that followed were staggering. $610 million worldwide, the highest grossing non-English language film ever made, a higher domestic box office than every major blockbuster released that same year. Every studio executive who had told Gibson with complete certainty that it would be the most catastrophic flop in cinema history watched their own productions fail to compete with a film spoken entirely in ancient dead languages with no stars, no advertising campaign, and no studio machinery behind it at all. And then Hollywood turned on Gibson with everything it possessed. The critical assault that erupted after the film's release was savage and completely sustained. Accusations of anti-Semitism saturated every major publication simultaneously. Gibson pushed back with precision and without retreating a single step. He said, "Jesus was Jewish. His mother was Jewish. His apostles were Jewish. How could I hate his own people? I did not film hatred. I filmed redemption." And on the industry's reaction specifically, he said, Hollywood did not want this film to exist. Not because they did not understand the message, but because they understood it all too well. Several people with direct connections to the industry during that period have since described the campaign against Gibson as unusually organized and coordinated in ways that went far beyond any normal critical response to a controversial film. These accounts have never been officially confirmed and must be treated as unverified claims rather than established fact. But Gibson's own description of what that period felt like was shocking. He said, "After the premiere, I felt like all hell was coming down on me. It was as if something invisible had declared war on me." 2 years after the premiere, in 2006, Gibson was arrested in Malibu driving while intoxicated. During the arrest, he made anti-Semitic statements that were recorded and published within hours. Photographs of him in handcuffs exploded across every media outlet simultaneously. The industry that had rejected his film watched it shatter every record imaginable, and then spent 2 years attacking him, now had exactly the weapon it needed to finish what it had started. Gibson described what followed as a public execution. He said, "The man who had directed Braveheart and won the Oscar suddenly became an outcast in his own industry. What came after were years of almost complete silence. He faced lawsuits, rehab treatments, and a suffocating isolation." He said in later interviews that he had contemplated his own death during those years. He described the period after the film as in some ways darker than the darkness that had preceded it, because he had touched the light and then lost it again. and he knew with devastating clarity exactly what he had lost. But in the middle of all of that destruction, he was working with his brother Donald and Braveheart screenwriter Randall Wallace on the second half of a story he had always believed was profoundly incomplete without it. Because Gibson had never once understood The Passion as a finished story, he had always seen it as the first half of something far larger. And what he was quietly building in those dark and silent years was something he described as a vision no human eye has ever seen on film. Gibson lost nearly everything after The Passion of the Christ: his reputation, his industry standing, his public life, and for a period his will to continue living. But the story he had started telling was not finished. It had never been finished. The Passion showed what was done to the body. The resurrection was always meant to show what happened next. And what Gibson is now preparing to show the world in the sequel is something that no film in the entire history of cinema has ever attempted to depict. Subtopic 5. What Gibson is about to show the world that no film has ever dared. For 20 years, while the world attacked Gibson, celebrated him, canceled him, and slowly began to rediscover him, The Passion of the Christ showed what was done to the body of Jesus Christ on the cross. The resurrection of Christ is going to show what happened when his spirit descended into the realm of the dead. And Gibson has been completely clear that it will be something no film has ever attempted to show. This is not a sequel in any conventional sense. Gibson has no interest in simply depicting the empty tomb and the risen Christ appearing to his disciples. That would be the expected version. The version that fits neatly inside what cinema has already done with this story many times before. Gibson is not building the expected version. What he intends to show is the descent. Between the crucifixion on Friday and the empty tomb on Sunday morning, 3 full days passed. Western cinema has always treated those 3 days as an absence, a gap in the story, a pause before the resolution arrives. Gibson intends to tear that gap wide open and show what actually happened inside it. His sources include apocryphal texts, writings from the early church fathers, and fragments from the Gospel of Peter. The theological concept at the center of the film is one of the oldest in all of Christian tradition, present in the Apostles' Creed itself, and affirmed across 2 full millennia of Christian theology. The harrowing of hell, the descent of Christ into the realm of the dead, his direct confrontation with the power of death itself, and the liberation of the souls held imprisoned there since the beginning of human history. It has been written about and preached for 2,000 years. It has never once been put on film. Gibson intends to be the first to put it there. He described the film's central experience as a cosmic confrontation between heaven and the abyss. He said, "It will show the darkness in the spiritual realm, the bewilderment of the apostles, the profound silence of Mary, the confusion of the Roman guards, and then the eruption of a light that does not go out again." He called it a mystical journey, a descent, and then an ascension. And he was completely direct about what he wants audiences to carry out of that theater. He said, "I do not want to show how Christ came back to life. I want to show why he did, not for himself, but for us." The release calendar Gibson constructed for the sequel was not built around commercial strategy or market timing. Part 1 will premiere on Good Friday, March 26, 2027. Part 2 will premiere exactly 40 days later on Ascension Day, May 6, 2027. 40 days. The precise number of days Christ remained on earth after the resurrection before ascending. Gibson said plainly that the calendar was chosen through faith, not strategy. He wants audiences to experience these 2 films as a liturgy, not consume them as weekend entertainment. The budget exceeds $100 million, more than double what was poured into making The Passion. Gibson has assembled theologians, historians, and visual artists working specifically to depict the spiritual dimension between death and resurrection, with genuine accuracy and real weight. He has described working with them as attempting to portray something that exists entirely outside the capacity of normal visual language, a realm where the rules of the physical world do not apply, and where the confrontation between light and darkness operates on a scale that cinema has never tried to render before. At a private conference in 2023, Gibson revealed that the film will contain one specific sequence that he has described to almost nobody in any detail. He said it is inspired by the Book of Revelation and the Messianic Psalms. He called it something no eye has ever seen on film. He has said absolutely nothing further about it publicly since that moment. It remains the most closely protected secret in the entire production. Jim Caviezel will not return as Jesus. Gibson made that decision deliberately. He said each generation must see the face of Christ with new eyes. The lead role has been given to Finnish actor Jaakko Outenan. Caviezel understood the decision completely. After nearly a decade of being effectively erased from Hollywood, Caviezel returned through Sound of Freedom in 2023, an independent film about a former American federal agent fighting child trafficking. Every major studio refused to touch it. Christian communities began sharing it across social media with urgent intensity. It spread through word of mouth and community organizing with no studio machinery supporting it at any point. Within months, it had grossed over $250 million worldwide and had outperformed major releases from Disney and Warner Brothers at the domestic box office. The man Hollywood had blacklisted for playing Jesus had returned through the exact same mechanism that had made The Passion an unstoppable global phenomenon. A story the industry rejected finding its audience anyway through the very people the industry had consistently and fatally underestimated. When asked what it felt like to have come back after everything, Caviezel said, "God gave me another chance. When the world shut its doors on me, he opened a much bigger one." Gibson's final word on everything, on both films, on the 20 years of silence and secret writing and isolation between them, on every dollar spent and every career sacrificed and every year lost in the darkness, is one sentence. The Passion showed how much Christ loved us. The resurrection will show how far that love went. Think carefully about what it means to hear those words from this specific man. A man who hit the floor of his own home with nothing left and cracked open a Bible in pure desperation, who sold everything he owned and threw $45 million of his own money at a film in dead languages that every single studio in Hollywood guaranteed would destroy him completely, who watched it become the highest-grossing non-English language film in the entire history of cinema, who was then publicly dismantled by the industry he had just humiliated, who spent years in silence staring into the possibility of his own death, who never once stopped writing the second half of the story through all of it. He said he has a belief in something greater than himself, and then he said the single line that explains everything. He said, "Because if it is me, we are all in trouble."